Ahoy everyone, I am your hostess, Felicia Goodnight. Welcome back to the RPG Maker Horror Files. So far we've covered a couple of rather famous games, but I believe it is quite important to look into lesser known games. Hidden gems, as all the cool kids say. Tonight we will dig our claws into a mostly forgotten, yet classic entry in its own way. This is the story of Palette, also known as Forget-Me-Not. The year is 2000. Good old Y2K. The ASCII Corporation is holding its fourth entertainment software contest, which is more or less like today's game jams, used to scout and/or reward potential game development talents. Interestingly, the first version of Corpse Party was submitted to the second iteration and won that one. But shh, that's irrelevant here. The winner of the fourth iteration was a 26-year-old man by the name of Nishida Yoshitaka, who also goes by the username Yubi Ningyo, which translates to finger puppet. The game he submitted that granted him victory over others was simply named Palette, a Windows-based puzzle horror game that he made using the RPG Tsuguru 95 engine, which was the first product in the RPG Maker line to make use of a Windows OS. The judges absolutely loved the game's ideas and awarded Nishida with a whopping 10 million yen. And shortly after, the game was remastered for PlayStation 1 with the new title of Forget-Me-Not. This port was developed by Enterbrain, a subsidiary of ASCII and Kadokawa that was directly in charge of the RPG Maker line of products. Thinking about it, it's quite an honor to receive such praise from the creators of the engine that they give you the resources to make it more accessible to others, as well as that huge load of money. Yet, despite all that fanfare, how come Nishida isn't a more prominent figure in the Japanese gaming industry? I tried really hard to find traces of Nishida's trail throughout the Japanese net, both using his real name and the Yubi Ningyo moniker, but none of the results directed me toward any relevant leads. But once more, my wild, baseless hypotheses are about to strike. Since the game made such a positive impression on the higher-ups at Kadokawa, I believe that it's a possibility that they hired Nishida to help in the development of future versions of the RPG Maker engine. Generally speaking, a lot of the resources used in the development apps are outsourced, and there's basically zero credit given to the people who do work on the code and other aspects of the program. Most of the time, it's just presented as, yeah, we are Enterbrain / Kadokawa / some other third-party company, and we made all this stuff. Which is kind of a shitty practice, but I'm not here to discuss the ethics of that. In conclusion, for all we know, Nishida could potentially be either dead or a skincare guru on Twitter, but I hope it's neither of those. In spite of the fame that Palette got back in the day, it never left the land of the rising sun, and its creator might as well have vanished from the face of the planet. Thankfully, even if the PS1 port never came to the West, the Windows version did make it out of Japan, thanks to the effort of our local goddess and independent translator, VG Person, who will become a very frequent figure in this series from this point onward. Thank you, base VG Person. Sadly, there are no English patches for the PS1 version, but we can manage with the original. The game's plot starts with Shianos B. Shian, a psychiatrist who often writes for a local newspaper. One night, just as he's about to close his office, he is threatened by an unknown figure from beyond his door, who holds Shian at gunpoint and forces him to tend to a patient on the phone. This patient is an amnesiac woman, whom we are told to call BD. What does it stand for? Bondage dominance? Big dick? Banjo-Kazooie? Nah, you'll see it eventually. For now, all we know about her is that she keeps seeing the color red. Well, Shian has no choice but to help the girl out, lest he'll find a cone of lead buried betwixt his eyebrows. Since the story deals with amnesia, the gameplay guides you through BD's memories in an attempt to recall the details that led to her situation. This is done through a series of puzzles based on stamina. Every time you step into a different room, you lose 1 point of stamina, and there's usually roadblocks in the form of glass panes that also hurt you when passing by them. You could call them glass panes. Jokes aside, don't be afraid of the glass. You have to take damage in order to continue in most cases. You're also given places to rest occasionally, which gives back some stamina points. If you lose all your stamina points, BD claims to have a headache and she hangs up on you. But Shianos, like any good psychiatrist, will ignore the girl's discomfort and continue pressing on until he knows everything. This leads to the biggest problem with the gameplay. You have to repeat the phone call sequence many times, because losing is mandatory, as it starts you at the first room in the game with all your health back. It only lasts a few seconds, so it's not like in Symphony of the Night where you're treated to an overly long game over sequence, but it can still get a bit annoying. Thankfully, as far as irritating things in gameplay go, that's pretty much the only one. BD can gain more stamina by interacting with the silhouettes that plague her empty subconscious, which helps her regain her memories throughout scattered scenes and allows her to access more rooms inside her mindscape. If you ask me, these mechanics, despite being somewhat tedious, lead to one of the most ingenious ways to explore an amnesiac character's memories that I've ever seen. With how prevalent the amnesiac protagonist trope is in fiction, it's really refreshing to see a game that actually tries to analyze it from a medical perspective, and with an interesting story to boot. The game feeds you its plot in a really subtle and meticulous manner, where you have to be the one to piece the disordered scenes together until you get the full scope of what happens in the plot. It may sound confusing initially, but it's easy enough to understand if you pay attention, and it makes total sense with the game's themes. There are things about the plot that I'd like to discuss in more detail, but you know the deal. I have to put a mandatory spoiler alert for those who want to experience the game blind as a bat. Very quickly into the game, you notice that BD has been surrounded by a violent environment, with some of the first things she remembers being blood and a knife. This, of course, continues to unravel into a complex conspiracy involving two separate murder cases. The first one was perpetrated by Macilt Cream, who, prior to the events of the story, carried out a massacre in the house of the Vector family, killing at least 4 people by setting the house on fire. The crocodile hasn't been the same ever since. The other murder, in turn, involves the death of Mr. McClunky Krim and his family, with the sole exception of his 6-year-old daughter, Canary Cream. I have no idea why they creamed the canary, but the killer of this case was Retrovector himself, in an act of revenge for his family. But here is where the game's themes start to shine. The incidents with Retrovector sparked interest in a theory known as the inherited sin. In the context of this game, it refers to the consequences of exposure to crime during infancy, and how, if a parent is a criminal, there's a high likelihood of children or other immediate family members committing crimes in the future. What's interesting about this theory is that it has a few counterparts in the real world. One of the pillars of Catholic belief is that humans inherited their willingness to sin from when Eve was tempted by the devil in the Garden of Eden, which serves as a way to hook these latent sinners on faith, as that is supposed to guide them to the path of purity. Aside from religion, there have been several studies that came to the same conclusion as the people in the game. A large majority of delinquents have family members who had been arrested at least once, and from a societal perspective, this makes perfect sense, given that word about these darker homes usually spreads fast, and the gossip around them is hardly ever a good influence. It's only a matter of time until little Timmy ends up getting called the son of a murderer. Now, obviously, even if there are cases like those, the theory is not absolute. My father was a criminal and generally a shitty person, but you don't see me committing crimes. But that's because I'm good at hiding them. Anecdotes and theories aside, the idea that the game exposes to prevent the sins from being inherited is a very dark and immoral experiment. There's only one way in which these inheritors of sin, or born of disorder as the game calls them, is by making them forget everything that ties them to their family. These BD children are taken to a new country, Zibar, and are forced to receive treatment through exotic cigarettes laced with amnesia-inducing drugs, effectively relocating them to a brand new life with a blank slate inside their heads. However, the theory and treatment are inherently flawed for two reasons. The first one is that even if they get shut out of their former world and their memories, they still make the news and get pressured by people who know full well about the events that made them born of disorder. What's the point of the child forgetting if everyone else remembers? The second flaw in the treatment is that amnesia is a condition that can be fought. Although hard to overcome, it's perfectly possible for an amnesiac to recover their memories through the appropriate stimuli. So no matter what, the inherited sin can never leave the children's lives. Don't think of this as me criticizing the game's story. These flaws in the theory are both subtly addressed in the story. It's extremely fascinating that the creator went out of his way to make a government conspiracy with realistic flaws. Compared to real-life experiments such as the CIA's disgusting attempts at using drugs to brainwash and torture prisoners, this game's ideas are so grounded in reality that it only makes it scarier. I could definitely buy it if some government was trying to pull shit like this in secret. As you've probably guessed by now, the game's protagonist is one of the children born of disorder, hence the BD in her name. She was experimented on after her father, Retrovector, committed his crime. This poor girl had to live an isolated life just to prove a thief, and naturally, that loneliness took a toll on her. She would often spend hours in an abandoned shack, pretending to be a famous psychiatrist from her favorite TV show. The character's name? Shianos B. Shian. That's right, from the start of the game you've been seeing a girl playing pretend as a coping mechanism to try to recover her unpleasant memories. And after all, she was still suppressing more. One night, her father, after an attempt at escaping prison, tried to break into BD's house to sever the sins that linked them by killing her. But due to the wounds he got during the escape and his guilty conscience, Vector was unable to do it. But as the police came back to arrest Vector, a red silhouette that consistently appears in BD's memories does something even more unthinkable. This red person, BD's mother, killed the people in charge of the Inherit Sin project and ran away with the girl, putting a massive bounty on her head. The game ends with that truth being revealed, and BD's mother, the woman who was supposedly threatening Xian at the start, offering the little girl the option to keep running. After that, we are only given a monologue that vaguely states that BD continued to use the Xian persona as a way to escape from her reality and cope with her trauma. For an RPG Maker game, this story is outstanding. It feels like the kind of plot you'd see in a professionally written crime novel. Compared to the usual teenagers go to a haunted place, get chased by monster archetypes, this goes very hard. And while it's a bit hard to piece together the story, once you do, it really gets to you. The game's visual presentation is nothing too special, but it should be noted that the game has several compatibility issues with modern versions of Windows. VG Person warned that the colors look off, and I personally had problems trying to run the game on full screen, which is sometimes necessary in order to notice some important details. The game's use of color is the reason why it's called palette. Red items usually carry great importance to the plot, and rooms that can be visited or have been completed are also distinguished by using those colors. On the other hand, white elements symbolize that which BD hasn't remembered yet. Get it? Because she's blanking? On top of that, the game originally had some kind of sepia filter applied over most scenes to make it look like an aged photograph, with only red colored things and important objects keeping their colors intact. Technically, the game can still be played like that, but due to the aforementioned compatibility issues, this can only be done in full screen mode, which unfortunately cannot be recorded very well. On that topic, I kinda prefer Forget Me Not as a title, given that it ties more into the topics of the game, while Palette feels more like a stretch. But there's something else that we ought to discuss: the game's audio. It was originally praised for its high quality sound effects, which occasionally grow louder when discovering key memories, and sometimes becoming extra layers in the background music. These extra layers include things like an extra drum line, heartbeats, clock sounds, and others. Unfortunately, when I first played the game, I had some major problems with the audio. At first, it worked just fine. There's not a lot of music to begin with, other than some short loops that play during investigation scenes. But once the layered sounds started showing up, the game glitched really hard on me. You see, the layered sounds are meant to go away after you leave the scenes where they're relevant, but for some reason in my case they never left. So essentially I had every sound in the game playing at the same time. I thought it was intentional at first, but it was so damn loud that I had to mute the game entirely to keep playing without losing my own memories due to brain damage. I only accepted that it was a glitch when the credits started playing, because by that point I turned up the volume out of curiosity, and the resulting mess was so loud that it nearly blew my head off. Regardless of my unlucky experience with the audio, I think Palette's sounds have a very creative way of increasing tension for each scene. That's essentially everything that's there to cover from the original Windows 95 version, but I made sure to try out the console port as well to see how they stack up to one another. The PS1 port seems to be a faithful but considerably enhanced remake. The visual presentation is much better, with more detailed sprites and a completely revamped HUD that replaces the plain stamina bar from the original with this really pretty silhouette of BD. The sepia effect returns and in this case works just as intended. We also get a very cool opening cutscene, as well as a brand new soundtrack with some nice tunes in there, and some full-fledged art of BD and Xian. This version does not have the audio layering from the original, so it does lose a bit of tension, but having music that isn't a 5-second loop is a good trade-off. The biggest addition to the port is the inclusion of hand-drawn CGs in voiced scenes, which helps illustrate what's happening in the story. Pun fully intended. The art style is very nice looking and fitting for this kind of story.
この人は私の父です。いつも帽子をかぶってたんです。家の中でも食事中でもいつも父は私に謝ってばかりいました。いつも家を留守にしてすまない、一人にさせてすまないってそう言っていました。
最近どうだ?
I couldn't tell if there were any big changes in the dialogue because my understanding of Japanese is pretty limited, but there seems to be a bit of a branching ending where you can get a different cutscene depending on the route you take, but it does not look like it changes the context of the story. Ultimately, I think it's a better product since, well, it had more than one person working on it. VG Person stated that she has no plans to make a patch for this version, which is unfortunate but understandable. Modding a game's files is considerably harder in a console game than a PC one. Ideally, it would be amazing if the game got re-released officially on Steam using the PS1 version as a base and giving that its own translation. Given how we've had several remasters of all RPGM titles like Misao or Witch's House on Steam, it should definitely be doable. Or at least do a straight re-release of it as a free-to-play title like what happened with Yume Nikki. I've read up on some Japanese blogs that consider the game a hidden gem that deserves as much recognition as those aforementioned games and want it to get released again, so at the very least there would be some demand for it. Initially, I intended to have a bit in the script where I try to push for a campaign to get the game re-released on Steam, but Obviously, we don't have a big enough audience to get the attention of big companies like Enterbrain or Kadokawa. Well, if you support the cause, try using the hashtag palette for Steam hashtag. That's redundant. But like I said, I wouldn't expect this to take off. As great as it would be to see a port of this game, it lacks the notoriety for the bigwigs to consider it worth spending money on. But hey, at the very least, the game is fairly easy to find. You can download the 95 version for free on VG Person's page. And thanks to my efforts, the PS1 version is on CD-ROMs too. And by efforts, I mean I just told the owner, I am scared of other ROM sites, please keep obscure game. I cannot link CD-ROMs in the description for legal reasons, but you know, just use Google, it's safe. If you want to experience the story properly, play the 95 version unless you know Japanese. Just hope you get lucky with the compatibility issues. Do you have any other RPG Maker or horror games you want me to discuss? Make sure to comment your suggestions, and please like the video and subscribe, or else you will lose all your memories. My name is Felicia Goodnight, and I'll see you on the next file. Sweet dreams!